Hello, my name is Petr Zelenka. I'm a scriptwriter, screenwriter, stage director, film director, and recently also a film producer. So, and I understand originally the plan was I would be talking to a live audience or to other scriptwriters or writers for theater. And thanks to coronavirus, I'm talking to the film camera. But so we can say that the technology is winning over live people. But I hope this is not the last word. You know, I hope we will have the last word, and eventually we'll be talking again to live people. You know, but for now, you have to make this work. You know, I studied scriptwriting at FAMU, the Prague Film Academy. In the late 80s, and at that time it was the only possibility how to study writing, dramatical writing in general. At that time you couldn't study writing for stage, for theater, and you still can't. So writing for film was the only preparation you could have for any sort of stage writing. And I studied that, and I graduated in 1991. And I became an official scriptwriter, which at that point was a kiss of death, because you were sure you couldn't get a job. We were sure we could never survive as scriptwriters because there was not enough work in film, in Czech film or in Czech television. So we were rather desperate at that time of graduation, right after the revolution. I come from the professional background. My parents also were both scriptwriters, and they were more lucky. My father survived fantastically as a scriptwriter. He was writing since the late 50s till the beginning of the 90s. And he was one of the crucial, most famous scriptwriters as far as television series go. After the graduation, I was also a bit disappointed by what they taught us at school, at the scriptwriters courses, because at that time it was all about the form, and they told us there needs to be a very strict form in script writing, classical scripts. We mainly used the textbooks of American scriptwriters or American tutors, like Simon Field or Frank Daniel. And we used these translated textbooks. And those guys, actually, those American guys were actually inspired by the Russian tutors in the 60s. So it was like a full circle, like the Russians taught the Americans how to write films, actually. Because in the old days, the Americans had no system of schools for writers. So all the writers were self-taught in America in the 60s, even the drama writers. So that everybody knew the craft as they went, as they started working for the big studios or theaters. So as they went, they learned it on the go. And then the Americans actually invited a couple of European scriptwriters and tutors, among them Frank Daniel. And Frank Daniel actually started the scriptwriter's education in the United States. He started in Columbia University in the 60s, and then he went to California, to UCLA and UCA. And at the beginning of the 70s, they finally started teaching people how to write for film in America. Before that, it was sort of non-existent. And we adopted these American or Russian rules how to write for film. And the disappointing thing about that was it was all about the form. It was never about the content. So they told us how to develop a character, how to work with the dialogue, how to build suspension and tension and release the tension and all that. And of course it was all these 5-piece drama according to Aristotle. And it was never about what are we talking about? You know, the topic was never there. So they pretended that if the form is perfect, and they said it's all about the form, the film's going to be perfect. And we knew it's a big lie, because you can have a lot of perfectly built films, and they can be boring, or they can speak about nothing. There was a famous script they taught us about, Chinatown by Robert Town. It's a classical masterpiece as far as the script goes. It's a fantastic script. Roman Polanski made it into a film, and it's a mediocre film. Despite there's Bob Rafelson, there's Jack Nicholson starring in the film. Despite that fact, it's not a great film. But the script is great. The film is not great, and the reason is it doesn't work like that always. You know. So being sort of tired of this classical form, and graduating a faculty and knowing that I will have no job, in a couple of years I turned into directing my own stuff, because I couldn't survive as a scriptwriter. And when I started directing my own scripts, I started to change the classical form of the scripts I wrote. And I started actually with 3 fake documentaries, or mockumentaries they call it, or fiction documentaries, which is a form where you take a form of a classical documentary using talking heads, or using fake reconstructions of events, and you use it to describe your own narration. You use it to support your fictional story. All these 3 documentaries were about the rock bands, actually, and the first one was in 1993, and it was very good way for me to be introduced into filmmaking. First, it was very cost effective. It wasn't really expensive, because using this fake documentary approach, you can save a lot of money. Also, I didn't study directing, and I didn't know how to compose a shot. You know, I didn't know anything about cameras or crossing the lines and all these things. So I just pretended I'm making a documentary, and I made it all up, but I used a very simple narrative language. And at that time, big inspiration for me was an American fake documentary film, This is the Spinal Tap. They made it in 1984, and it's a documentary about a band that never existed, and it's basically all the funny things that can happen when a band goes on tour, and the manager of the band becomes a woman, and all that. So you have all these funny pieces, funny jokes about musicians, and but those were actors acting in a fiction documentary on that American film. In my case, I bent the rules of the fake documentary even a bit more, because I was using real people, real musicians. I was using them, they played themselves in a fictional story. So it was really weird, really inspiring at the same time, and reality and fiction clashed in every second. Like, you would have a real person describing his or her childhood that never happened actually, but sometimes something similar happened. So we were always on the verge of fiction and truth, and there was always a strong motif, strong theme in each of these fake documentaries, and we realized it's also a very non-Hollywood approach to filmmaking, because once you get rid of the actors, it's enormous freedom you get, because actors are great, but they limit you in so many ways, financially, time-wise, and the limitations also come from all the parts they had before that are written on their forehead. So when the audience sees an actor, they see all the big parts he or she had before, you know. So it's sort of like a backpack they have always, you know, like the big famous parts they acted before. So it was, for me, it was a great start into the business, because it was cheap, it was innovative, and it worked fantastic. In 1997, I made my first big feature film. It was called Buttoners, and it was again playing with the form of a full-length script. It was composed of 6 short stories, and at first it looked like they have nothing in common, but as the film went, you realized they have something in common, and then at the end you realize they actually happen at the same time, at the same place, roughly within 3 hours, one summer night in Prague, 1995. The first story, though, was taking place 50 years earlier in Japan in 1945, when the atomic bomb was supposed to be dropped on the city of Kokura, and they changed it for Hiroshima. So it was a weird mixture of a period film, present film. It was taken place at night mainly. I used a lot of non-actors, plus some really famous actors, so we got this weird mixture of both ends of the spectrum. And it really pulled the viewer in, because the viewer was realizing how well these parts are connected as we go into the story. And you start with a big thing. You start with the atomic bomb being dropped on the wrong city. And then they evoke the ghost of the American pilot that dropped the bomb, and it goes pretty wild, you know, the story. And it became a cult movie here, and we had a big success at various film festivals, because the time was right actually for this sort of thing. Some people said it reminded them of Night on Earth by Jim Jarmusch. It's probably because there was a character of a cab driver in my film also, and it took place at night, but it wasn't really Night on Earth. But again, the form was very, very bizarre. You know, it wasn't at all a classical story. There was another film that was very weird or innovative as far as the form goes, and it was a film called Karamazovs, or Brother Karamazovs, which I made in 2008. Originally, I wanted to capture a stage performance that I saw in a small Prague theater, and I loved the performance so much, and I said we have to capture it on film somehow, probably in a straightforward documentary form. And I didn't even direct the performance. It was a friend of mine. And they said, okay, let's do whatever you like. And I started working on that documentary. And again, it evolved as a fiction film. And I ended up with a story of a Czech actors, an ensemble traveling to Poland to the shipyards originally to act this performance at this theater festival, and we were actually watching their last rehearsal before the final show that night. And at the rehearsal there are some workers from the shipyard, and one of the workers has a personal tragedy because his son died, and just at the moment when they're rehearsing the show actually, and he's in a weird state of mind, and he decides to keep on watching the rehearsal, and they continue the rehearsal, and they basically play for him, for this guy, because the actors realized what happened. And at the end, the guy, the Polish worker, commits suicide, but not before he watches the whole performance, the whole rehearsal. So it's again a weird mixture of theater, film, real life, and stage, backstage, on stage. In this film, we actually couldn't film it in the shipyard in Gdańsk because it was too complicated production-wise, and we ended up in steelworks, which was okay. I mean, the backdrop of steelworks was great, and we didn't even use the Polish steelworks. We ended up in Czech Republic, but nevertheless, it worked perfect. You know, the dark hall of the steelworks, and the actors on a very rough stage, and Dostoevsky being cut down to really basic lines and basic storyline of brothers Karamazovs. And what I loved about this film was that we constantly changed the view from backstage and on stage. So very often you would have a scene when an actor finishes rehearsing and sort of steps aside and becomes a normal person again and discusses something on the phone or whatever he has to do. And then within the next second, he's on stage again acting. And this turning on and off, you know, being an actor, being a person, that was for me something like quantum mechanics. You know, when you watch a particle, and it can be an energy, it can be a wave form, it can be a matter, you know, and who judges that? You know, it depends on the view of the experimentator. So again, this was up to you, whether this actor was an actor or a character in the play. And of course, at the end of the film, it all mingles. You know, everything is united. Everything is just one thing, and actors become characters, and characters actors. So that was a very, I would say, experimental film, and it was received okay. But I had a feeling if we did it in the '60s, it would be a smashing hit. You know? And having done that in 2008, I think it was like 40 years late. But anyway, I had to do it. You know. Another experimenting with the structure, probably the most crucial was called Lost in Munich. It was a film that I made in 2015, and actually the idea came to me like 10 years earlier, and I wanted to do a DVD on the film. That was when DVDs were popular. So you would always have the main film, then you would have bonuses, you would have the director's comment, narration, and you would have making of, you know, very often, and some other bits and pieces of stuff, you know, to make the DVD rich, you know. And I thought, well, maybe we could have a film that would be like this DVD, you know. You could have a main film and bonuses and narration and all mixed together. And I started to write this sort of script, and it didn't work, you know. And I ended up with a form that was slightly different. It was a short film, about half an hour, and making of, the film about filming the film, which was about an hour long, you know. And I put this together, and we had the structure of Lost in Munich, and the theme is very important. The theme is the Munich betrayal of Czechoslovakia by France and England in 1938. And in the film, you realize it's one big myth. It's a historical myth that still a lot of people, or majority of the people here, believe that we were betrayed. And the point is, it was the plan of our President Beneš back then. That was his plan. But in history books, they still repeat the same lie, that we were betrayed. So on one level, it's a historical lesson, this film. On another level, there are pretty bizarre things, because the first half an hour of the film is a completely bizarre story about the parrot of Edouard Daladier, the French Prime Minister of that time. The parrot apparently lives 90 years or whatever, and they invite the parrot to the press conference today, to speak about the events, you know. And he's such a famous parrot that he can imitate Daladier's voice, so you could actually hear his voice, and it's a sort of a insight into his life, you know. So there's a press conference at the French embassy in the film, and they invite the famous parrot, but the parrot causes a scandal because he starts saying really weird things, you know. He praises Hitler and says nasty things about Czechoslovakia in Daladier's voice, you know, and parrot is even invited to the Czech television, you know, to speak live, and he causes a proper scandal. And actually, at the end of this short film, the head of the French Institute decides to get rid of the parrot, actually, because he's such a nuisance, you know. So he does a swap, and he actually swaps him for a really nice bird that looks the same but that doesn't say things like this, you know. So it's a very bizarre short story, and then you realize how they actually shot this short film, and you realize why the film was never finished, because the main actor died, and you realize why he died. So I like that style, actually, but it was really demanding for the viewers, you know, because they had to follow. We were jumping in time back and forth, you know, and you had to really follow it closely, and you had to pay a lot of attention to this form, and it was rewarding at the end. But once they showed this film on television, and people were not fully concentrated, they lost it, you know. So for cinemas it was great, and for clever audience and intelligent audience, great. But the lower you get on the social rank or the focus rank, the worse reception we got. I jump to theater writing now. So with the film, I think I tried to be non-classical, or I tried to change the classical form of script writing, while in theater, I think I'm quite classical, or well, theater in general is more experimental than film, or it's much broader. I sometimes think that you can describe film as one part of theater. The theater is everything, and it can be divided down to little niches, and one of the niches is film. Like, you can take it as that. You know, so film is much more narrow, it's much more limited, and theater is really plastic. You know, it's wider. So theater in general gives you more opportunities everywhere, and I think I didn't have an urge to experiment with theater writing, partly because I didn't study it. Second, because there have been so many experiments already in theater, and there are at the same moment, and also the very experimental theater, like the way what the Germans do, you know, the stuff like it's almost no theater at all, you know, like you take the audience to the House of Commons, you know, and they watch the House of Commons to negotiate a law. You can call it a theater. So some theater is really experimental. So on this scale, I think I'm pretty straightforward classical stage writer. And it started in 2001. I was really lucky because I was commissioned my first work. I never wrote for nobody. I always wrote for a specific group of actors, for specific theater. And in 2001, I was offered to write a play for a small theater at Davice. They call it Davidské Theater, which by then was already a pretty important venue, and it grew even more important, and it's one of the key theaters nowadays, although it's pretty small. It's a small audience of 130 seats, and but great cast. And we just agreed on the date of the premiere, nothing else. You know, the artistic director gave me a free hand of doing whatever I liked, and we only agreed that I would use the in-house actors, the actors from the theater, plus 2 guests actors, because I needed some older people, and they didn't have them. And I remember I wanted to try everything that was not possible in the film. So at first I wanted to have like true darkness. I said I have to have a true darkness, because in the film there's no darkness, you know. So I have to have a scene in total darkness. We have to turn all the lights off, and even these fire escape lights, you know, we have to be turned off. And I want an audience to enjoy darkness, you know. I want true fire, you know, that was the other thing, fire, you know. You cannot have it in the film. I wanted a real closeness of the character. I was obsessed by actor being like in your face, really, and stuff like that, you know. And I was really lucky, because I took some ideas from Charles Bukowski and some ideas of my own, and I made a mixture of quite weird motifs. I called the play, I borrowed the title from one of the Bukowski's books even. I called it Tales of Ordinary Madness. And I took some scenes from my drawer, you know, the things you scribble down along the years, and the scenes you couldn't use in the film because they were either too bizarre or too out of this world. And I made a weird mixture of motifs, but there was a strong main character who was a guy who eventually, after all he's been through, and after all the madness he sees from his family and his friend and his girlfriend and all that, he packs himself up in a box and sends himself off to Chechnya, which is a very elegant way of committing a suicide. But before he does that, it's quite a funny story. And the main guy was actor Ivan Trojan, and he did a fantastic job with that. And he became not only the main character, he became sort of a priest, you know. He was, other characters were confessing to him their bizarre life stories, and he was soaking it all in, you know. He was accepting it. He was pardoning them, actually. And he became such a great character, and the play was very, very successful, and also internationally, which was great, because having the success with the first thing you write, it's always the best thing you can have. I think at the end we ended up with like 60 other productions of this play around the world. You know, in Poland alone there was about 16 productions we had. I remember I met recently an actor in Poland, and he said I spent 14 years acting in your play, you know, which was like 1/3 of his life. Since then, I've written 9 more plays, which is roughly 1 play in 2 years, which is, I think, a good pace. You know, I believe that as a writer, you don't have to be overproductive. I think the system should be as good as that you can survive writing one thing in 1 year or one thing in 2 years, and you should be able to survive with that, you know, as a professional writer. The system shouldn't force you to write 3 television series every year, because there's no space for so many writers. There's not enough audience, you know. The more if you're overproductive, it's so much burden for the audience, you know, and suddenly there's so much competition with other writers, you know. So I think it's also important to find your place within your society and within your generation and within the system of writing in your own country. In all these, with all these cases of 9 or 10 stage plays, I've always written for a specific group of actors or an ensemble of actors for a specific theater venue. They always commissioned the work from me, and I always delivered it on a agreed date, and I always directed myself the first opening night. Then these texts were done by other directors in other countries, or sometimes other directors in Czech Republic. But I've always done the first show, the first production. And it's very important. Also, all these theaters were so-called repertory theaters, which means they had other plays on in the repertory. Usually it would be around 15 plays at the same time running in the repertory, which amounts to each of them being shown 2-3 times a month. And my play would be one of these 15. And you would compete with Shakespeare or some Brecht or Molière or classical stuff, experimental stuff, and sometimes you would compete with your local colleagues also. And it would all happen on the same stage in the same theater. I think this is very good for writers, and it's because repertory theater reduces the risk of one single individual show. If the show is the flop, or if the play is a flop, it's not a disaster, because you realize it gradually as the audience stop coming, and you can play it less often, and you can play other plays more often, so you can balance it against other plays in the repertory, and gradually you can stop showing it, And if the play is a success, it can run forever, Some of the runs I had was the longest run I had in Czech Republic was 9 or 10 years, or even 11. And you can really react on the demand of the audience. If the audience likes it, you run longer. If they don't, you run shorter. It's as simple as that. And also, a lot of the costs of the individual performance would be distributed because you have in-house actors that are actually on the payroll of the theater. They are at your disposal, and they are not paid to be in your specific show. They are paid to be in that theater. And you have a lot of collaborators that are also on the payroll. So there are not so many people on the contract on this individual show, and it reduces the costs of the show. When I tell you that with an important theater like Davidce, the cost of the show would be 30,000 euros. It's crazy for people in the West, because the honorarium alone of a leading actor would be higher abroad. But with such limited costs, we are very free. You're very free. You can do whatever you like, and as a theater director, you can invite unknown writers to collaborate with you, which is important. So I didn't feel any pressure when I started writing for theater. I tried to do my best, but the pressure was not there, actually. At the same time, the run of the films that I was making got shorter and shorter. When I started in the 90s, you would have a film in cinemas for a year without a problem, or sometimes a year and a half. And then it got shorter and shorter. And with the digital cinema revolution that the guys around Steven Spielberg brought, with digital film print, the run of the films got really shorter, and now it's sometimes 4 weeks and then it's over. So at the same time, you have a theater play that runs for 10 years, and you have a film that runs for 4 weeks, which is such a disbalance. And of course, I prefer theater. I want my colleagues and friends. I like the chance to invite them to see what I've done, And if I want to invite them to see the film that I've done, and they are abroad for a short piece of time, they miss the film, And so yes, I prefer theater to film now. So back to stage writing. Coming from the film background, the theater critics realized that and called my writing for theater filmic. I'm not quite sure what they mean about that, but I suspect they mean that I have, usually in the theater plays, I have more scenes than usual. I don't know what the average number of scenes should be. There's no rule about that, but generally you have 2 or 3 acts. Each act could be divided into 3, 4 scenes. So yes, we can say you have 12 to 15 scenes in a classical play of Shakespeare. I always had more. I would end up having 25 to 30 scenes. So, I mean, the editing would be more rapid, and that's probably what they call filmic. I actually have to say I enjoy these editing my stage play. It was the first time I did it in Tales of Ordinary Madness. I actually followed the pattern of making a film. So we had a month of rehearsals. I changed the scenes a lot according to the improvisations of the actors. I would write down them improvising, and then we would sort of finish the text, and I started swapping the scenes around. And they said, Petr is in the editing room. And I thought, yeah, this is exactly the process I'm used to. Swapping the scenes around. And I didn't realize for an actor, it's complete madness, because they were used to this scene following this one, and all of a sudden there's another scene behind that and another scene after that. And the main character was, main actor, Ivan Tran, was really crazy before the premiere, because he didn't have a clue what's coming up next. But I enjoy the process of editing the play, actually. And next time I directed a play, I reduced this obsession with editing, but I still love jumping in time in the text, and I think we can talk about that a lot. That's an important thing. That's a division between film and theater in the passage of time, how the time passes in film and how the time passes in theater. The film, by its very substance, is a non-linear. It's sort of digital by means of non-linear. You understand very well, even as a non-experienced viewer, that there's one shot and there's another shot, and those shots were made in different time, and they were put together artificially. And you understand it because and subconsciously, knowing that, you know that there's no miracle when you open the door in the film and you cut to another part of the living room, and the door is already closed, and the character is already talking to somebody. You know, you understand this is a film language, and you really understand that language pretty well, because there's been 100 years of film, and it's really deep inside us already. But in the theater is continuous, so you know that when the actor opens the door, he has to close the door, because there's no editing in the theater. But what's more important is when you edit between the scenes, when you jump in time between the scenes in theater, that's very exciting, unlike in the film. So in theater, it's much more exciting to think about what happened between the scenes. Well, it's very exciting for a viewer to think about what you're not showing to him. In the film, that's not interesting at all. You understand the language, you understand you have to stick this to this, and you stick together a scene. But in a theater, what happened between the scenes and what you're not showing to the audience is equally important as what you are showing to the audience. In one of my plays that I wrote in 2014, which was called Job Interviews, and at some countries they call it the Vera, because the main character, the lady, is called Vera. I use this principle. It's a story about the casting director or an actor's agent a very ambitious lady of 45, 50 years of age. And it's a series of good things that happen to her. And eventually you realize it's a portrait of a complete loser. So all the good things come together as a complete downfall of this character. Because what I'm saying is we are no longer able to say, is this a success or is this a failure? You know, the concept of success or failure has somehow mingled up in our heads. So we don't know if the divorce is a success or a failure. We don't know if when my father died, it was good for him or bad for him. And I don't know if my company has merged with a bigger company, if it was a good thing or bad thing. And she's constantly confronted with these sort of good and bad things. And I've used this principle of jumping in time. There's a storyline in the play when her father is disabled. She finds a nurse for him, a very fat and ugly lady. He falls in love with the nurse, and she's unhappy about that. She thinks the nurse is below his standards, and she goes and pays the nurse a lot of money to fuck off, you know, to get rid of her. Then the father realizes why the nurse has suddenly disappeared from his life, and has a very strong argument with his daughter, and it's a very bitter scene, very bitter argument. You cut to another scene when she has an argument with her brother at the funeral about the quality of the flowers at the funeral service, and you realize it's the father's funeral. He died, and they haven't seen each other since. So the last time they saw each other was the heavy argument they had 3 months earlier. So she destroyed his last attempt at loving somebody, and the last time she spoke to his father, they cried at each other. You know? So simply realizing that these scenes are so close to each other gives it enormous power and sadness also. There's another thing that works differently in film and in theater, and it's retrospectives, actually. Retrospectives, in terms of remembering the old things, the old times, it works perfectly in theater. Of course, the actors don't get any younger, but you understand the style of it, and you understand they are acting themselves when they were children or whatever. But there's one thing that you cannot really do in theater, which is going back to the actual scene that you've already seen in the same performance. I'm talking about the structure like in Pulp Fiction, when you have a film that opens with a scene in the restaurant where they rob a restaurant, they aim a gun at people, cut, there's opening credits, and then you go back later, you get back to this same scene, and you actually repeat some of the shots from the scene, and now you know the background of the scene. Now you know that there are real killers among these people in the restaurant. You can never do that in theater. You can never go back to the same scene, actually, because the passing of the time is different in theater. It always goes forward, and the audience wouldn't believe you that you actually jumping to something they have already seen an hour ago. They know it's not true. There's a great play by Michael Frayn called Noises Off, and it was a world hit, smashing hit. It was on Broadway for a couple of years, and Jiří Menzel did it here in the 90s in Činoherní klub. And it's a very clever concept, again, playing with time and space. You know, you're watching a stage play being produced, and the first act is like the last rehearsal before the opening night and the chaos, you know, and you see it from the front, from the stage. The second act is you watch it from the background, from the back, you see the backstage, and it's about the 20th performance they have, and the director comes visiting and sees that the chaos is even bigger. Then there's a third act, and it's probably the last show they have. You see it from the front again, and you see what's left of the original play. It's not much left, you know, because some of the actors are already not there, and it's about a hundredth performance, and it fell into pieces, really. So Michael Frayn, what he does is he plays with space, theater space, and backstage, on stage, which I like very much. And I like the concept so much that with his permission, I wrote a play called Train Departures. And I used the same concept of watching one play from the front, from the back, and from the front. And it's only for 2 actors. It's very demanding. It's a sort of a farce. The story is very simple. There's a couple actors. They used to be man and wife. They've been divorced, but she's starting dating another actor from the company, and the tension was so huge that the company actually fell apart, and actors started leaving the company. And out of the 7 actors, there are only 3 left: her lover, and her ex-husband. And this is the night when the lover says, I'm fed up with that, and he doesn't show up either. So this is the night when only her and her ex-husband show up for the performance originally intended for 7 people. So this is the setup. And you see the first act, you see a farce for 2 people. There's a lot of background noise, a lot of offstage shouting, you know, a lot of mistakes apparently. And you don't know what's going on. Then with the second act, it turns around, you see the backstage, but you also move in time backwards, like 1 hour before the show started. And you realize that the guy came to the theater, but he doesn't remember anything, and he's got problems with memory, and he's lost, basically. And you understand why all these mistakes happened, you know, because this is the play intended for many more actors than there are left, you know. But as you go with the second act, you come to the point when the show starts, which is the point when you started in the act 1. The only time now you see it from the backstage. And they were trying to do it exactly the same way they acted the first act. But it was never possible because the audience simply couldn't accept the thing that they are watching the same action, like the very same action, from the different angle. Like in the film, it would be simple because we would literally repeat the same shots. But here in theater, they could never repeat it 100% exactly the same. And the audience understood the concept, but they didn't fully enjoy it because that was my wrong thinking, you know. And only in the third act, when you move in time and they're trying to finish the play and you see it from the front again, the audience fully enjoyed it because we didn't have that time lapse thing. But I wasn't aware of it when I was writing it or when we were rehearsing, but only after a couple of shows I realized what the problem is, that you never literally come back in time, return in time on stage to the time that's already passed, you know, which was, I probably should have read it somewhere, but I didn't, you know. So there's no, you cannot do stuff like Pulp Fiction on stage or Memento or I don't know, Amores Perros, you know, or there's an old film called Lola Rent, you know, about a girl that runs for the life of her fiancé, you know. You cannot do that in theater, you know. Okay, adaptations. Adapting from film to theater or from theater to film. I have experiences with adapting from theater to film, actually, and there are some rules I can speak about there, or some problems, if you like. My most important experience was adapting my play Tales of Ordinary Madness into a film, which happened like 4 years after I've made the theater premiere. The logic behind was simply commercial, and me and the producer, we thought we'd make money with the film to actually make another film that we liked. You know. The business side was quite easy because when you adapt a famous play, it's easier to get the money. And this time the commercial television was on board, and we had some private money, and though we didn't get very much money, the budget was really, really nice, you know, to our standards. But the artistic problems were great. I didn't realize it will be so difficult. One thing, the film is a very realistic media. You know, whatever you say, it's very descriptive, and it likes reality. While theater is very imaginative, it's based on other narrative, other visual concepts, and it's completely different media. So I realized I couldn't keep some of the storylines I had in the play. I couldn't keep them because they were too fairy tale-like or too unrealistic. You know. There was a line in the play, the best friend of the main character called Mucha, and he's a pathetic masturbator. He gave up on women, doesn't like women because they left him so many times. He gave up and says, I'm gonna masturbate only because it's the safest way for me to go through my life, and it's the most decent way I can go through my life. And he developed very funny ways of masturbation with a kitchen sink and with a vase from flowers and all the objects he uses. And the main character feels sorry for him, of course, because he says, look, this is not a life you should be leading. Then this Mucha has a final attempt with a woman, with a cleaning lady. It's a disaster again. He ends up injured, and he says, that's the end. And he buys a shop window mannequin and starts living with a mannequin. And the main character is even more sorry for him, and he says, what are you doing? You're living with a mannequin, you know? It's a piece of plastic, it's not alive. And Mucha says, yes, it's plastic, it's not alive, but she cannot leave me. And that's the main thing, you know? And we have a sort of relationship, like, she doesn't say anything, but she's sort of nodding, or she's listening when I say something. So he goes into this madness, you know, deeper and deeper. And then the main character is so sorry for him that he actually takes the mannequin from him. He steals the mannequin because he doesn't like the concept of his best friend living with a mannequin. And he keeps the mannequin with him in his flat, and the mannequin comes alive. It's a miracle. And it's a second miracle for the main character, because shortly before that his blanket came alive. So it's another thing that comes alive, and it's a mannequin and becomes a beautiful woman and in love with Mucha. And they end up being a perfect couple. They live together happily ever after. And the main character loses his best friend this way. So this sort of storyline, I thought we can't have it in the film because it's far too much. You know, it's like mannequins coming to life and all this masturbation, which in the film it's a problem because in theater you can do it backstage. You know, you see the guy leaving the stage, coming back. You don't see the actual masturbation, of course, but everybody knows what he's being doing off stage. In the film, it's difficult to show it, and it's also difficult not to show it, because then why is it there, you know, if you're not showing it? So the film as a descriptive media is very bad for showing masturbation, for not showing the masturbation or nudity in general. So I thought I'll cut this out. I cut this whole storyline out, and actually it crippled the film. Actually, the film lost a very important piece, and it wasn't never any good. You know, I think it really hurt the film, and I didn't realize it when we were making it. But some years later, I thought that this was the crucial mistake I made. You know, cutting this unrealistic storyline from the story. There was enough jokes in the film to make it go. You know, but we've lost something. And I think at the same time we had to lose it. So I think it was a non-winning situation. I think we couldn't do it. We couldn't have both, you know. So when adapting theater to film, very often there'll be choices that you cannot win. You know, simply you have to lose. You know, it's very important the role of an actor in film and theater. People sometimes don't realize it when adapting from theater to film, but in the theater the role of an actor is completely different, and the main difference is that the actor brings the space. If you have the main actor, very often he or she associate with stage as such, you know, so very often they become the soul of the stage and the stage becomes them. So it's much easier in theater to achieve unity of action or unity of a character by simply having one actor watching or just being there, and you understand the stage is his or her space, and whatever happens on stage, even with other people, minor characters, it's somehow related to him or her. So it's much easier to build a strong main character on stage, because the stage helps you, helps him, helps her to become the main character. You know. In the film, if you want to have the main character as strong as in the theater, you have to spend much more stage time or film time on them. You know, so if you just keep the proportion, like having the main character 40% of the time on screen or on stage, there are two different things, you know. So very often you can end up not having the proper main character in the film, just basically adapting it one-to-one. In the film, you have an architect. He builds a kitchen, and then you invite the actor in, and he cooks eggs in the kitchen. In the theater, you have an actor, and he creates the kitchen for you. You know, he pretends he's in the kitchen, he's doing something, and from what he's doing, you understand you're in the kitchen, and he's frying eggs. So it's a completely two different aspects. And for the writer, what is more inspiring, I think, theater, but adapting film to theater or theater to film, it can be very tricky, and very often it doesn't work, and a lot of adaptations don't work, you know, and I think including this adaptation of mine, you know. There's one more thing very important, that it's an interval, or intermission, they call it. It's something that you don't have in the film anymore. It used to be there in the old days, 20s, 30s. They used to make intervals, especially when the films in Hollywood were really long. And I wonder what it felt like. I cannot imagine that. But with a theater, the interval is a great thing, and you can make a big use of it, because there are two things. You've already developed the characters and the story, and the audience already likes what you're acting, what they're watching, and so at the same time they're looking forward to coming back and watching the same story go on, but they also hope something's going to be slightly changed after the interval. So they want to come back to the same thing that's slightly twisted, and it can be a twist of scenography, or it can you can have another character, you know, coming, or you can change the tone of the narrative also, which is very exciting. If you have an idea for a play, that actually falls into two pieces, it's very good for the theater, because the audience lets you do it. They will not be angry at you when you change the voice, they change the tone after the interval. Because the unity of space and the unity of actors is so strong, they invite the change that you're going to do. You know, they're very permissive in this respect, and they sometimes unconsciously demand it in the audience. As I said, I started with the so-called fake documentaries or fiction documentaries when I started directing as a director for film. And I recently came sort of full circle to using this documentary aspect in theater. That's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. And again, I was inspired by my friend Michael Frayn, a great British playwright. Michael Frayn introduced to theater a documentary play. There have been other people who wrote like this, but he is the one who actually made this style famous, especially with a play called Copenhagen. It's a masterpiece. It's a play about 3 actors, 3 real-life characters. It's Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, and wife of Niels Bohr. So 2 nuclear physics and the wife of one of them. They meet after they've died, they meet in heaven, and they're trying to reconstruct the famous actual meeting they had in Copenhagen in 1942. At that point, Denmark was occupied by Germany, by Nazi Germany. So the guys that used to work together during the 20s and 30s are suddenly on the opposite parts of the barricade. More so, Bohr is probably working for the Americans, and Heisenberg is the head of the Nazi nuclear program. The result of this meeting is absolutely crucial, because as a result of that, Nazi Germany didn't build an atom bomb while the Americans did, which is a really big importance. The thing is, when reconstructing this meeting in heaven, the characters cannot agree on a single thing. So they cannot agree on anything, mainly about the reason why Heisenberg came. They cannot agree on whatever any of them said, and they cannot agree on the results of the meeting. And of course, everything is relative. So you start with relativity of the dialogue, with the relativity of morals, because it was Born who actually helped to construct the bomb, but he wasn't a Nazi. There was a Nazi Heisenberg, but he didn't construct the bomb. Yeah? So that's who's the bad guy here. I mean, and you end up with relativity of history and such. So it's wonderful. It's so condensed, you know. And the style is very exciting because they constantly comment, they narrate. Each of the characters has the right to comment on the other characters, and also they have classical action, a classical dialogue. So you have acted out scenes and narration all the time, you know. And you're jumping back and forth, you know, everybody is narrating and acting at the same time. And it's very demanding for the actors, but very rewarding for the audience. Michael Frayn repeated that scheme or this style later on in a play called Democracy, which is a play by Willy Brandt, the Prime Minister of Germany, that has a not knowing that he has his right hand, his best friend was a spy from East Germany, and he used it again in the play called Benefactors. So there are three very, very good plays, and I was always intrigued by this style, you know, because I thought if we could get that, you know, it helps you. First, it helps you to get across a lot of information. You know, you can, with a style like this documentary stage play, you can get a lot of information across, you know, to the audience. It can be very compact, and what I was afraid of was that you lose the emotions, because if the actors have the right to comment, to use narrative, the emotions would be weaker, I thought. And the first time I tried to use this style was a play called Theremin. It was about a real person, Leon Theremin, which was a Russian spy in the 20s and 30s, and actually he lived until the 1993. And he was also an inventor, and invented loads of things, and among them he invented the first musical instrument, electric musical instruments. And on top of that, it was an instrument that you didn't touch with your hands. It was a non-touchable electric musical instrument called theremin vox. So you had simply two antennas, and by the distance of the right hand you changed the pitch, and the distance from the left antenna you changed the volume. So you are simply waving your hands close to these antennas, and there's people completely mad. But that was the first electric instrument, first ever. And later on, electric guitar came, you know, and other instruments that we know and that we use, and synthesizers that actually were based on some of the things from theremin vox. So telling this story of this guy in New York in 1930s, where he's sent to New York to spy on American industry, at the same time he starts first big concerts with his electric orchestra. So it was such a fascinating story as such. So I thought to describe the whole complexity of this character, we have to use this documentary approach. And I spent half a year actually rehearsing already with the actors of Davidské Theatre, and then I was too afraid to use it, and I cut all the comments out, and we ended up with a straightforward play, not documentary, like in this sense. And it was very successful anyway. The problem of the play was that the real guy was so interesting and so bizarre, and his story, his life was so unbelievable that the audience thought I made it all up. We tried to make sure they understand it, so we printed out the leaflets, you know, the brochures. We gave everybody saying this guy really existed, and that's it. And they said, yeah, it's fake, you know, these brochures. And then they looked it up on the internet, so they believed it. But even to make them believe that we actually played the musical instruments was really difficult, because everybody thought it was pre-recorded. So that was a difficult part of the play. But apart from that, it worked beautiful, and it stayed on for 11 years. And it was also done in Russia and other places. But, so I was always attempting to use this documentary stage play. And finally, 2 years ago, I picked up my courage and I did a documentary stage play. It's called The Elegance of the Molecule. And it's a play about a Czech chemist. Again, it's a play about real people, real existing people. It's about a Czech chemist who invented the molecules that they use for curing the AIDS. And about 80% of the people around the world are cured by these chemicals. The other character was a Belgian inventor, and the third guy was the American developer and a chemist, John Martin. And it's a story of cooperation between three people spread out between 1986 to 2012, when this Czech chemist died of some brain dysfunction. You know, his death was very pathetic and sad. And I was afraid about the emotions again, but luckily we got a lot of emotions there, because his life story was so sad, and his death was very sad, and he was becoming really, really rich towards the end of his life, when he could no longer make any sense out of it. He didn't even realize he's so rich. because the money was simply pouring from the patents, you know. He was like working hard for 70 years, and suddenly he was getting billions of crowns, and he didn't even know it because he was completely brainwashed at that time, you know. He had some sort of weird Alzheimer stuff, you know. So the play actually started with a scene that actually happened. That there's a funeral of this famous Czech chemist, Mr. Holly, and the head of the chemical institute calls his widow and says, "Ludmila, I'm sorry. I know this is not the right moment. It's the day that your husband died, and the funeral. But I think I have to be clear with you. I think there's about 1.3 billion crowns on his account somewhere. I'm not sure you know it." And she didn't have a clue, you know. And she sort of gasps and hangs up, you know. And that's the opening scene. So it's a story about chemistry and biology and disease and of course history, because while these people were making these fantastic cures, you know, the world changed completely, you know. The communism disappeared, you know, and chemistry changed, you know, and pharmacology changed completely. And it's also a story about big money, you know, about how you either don't have the money or you have so much money that you're ashamed of it, you know. So and it worked, and I was really lucky, but I think I'm gonna get back to this approach again, because it was so rewarding, this documentary aspect of the stage play. And again, they were acting the scenes out, you know, and commenting on them, you know, other people commenting on what was happening on stage, you know. So there was a lot of stage presence, a lot of actors present on stage all the time, just being there, you know, commenting from time to time, and the audience would sort of pan, you know, see who's talking, who's watching who. And the only person that didn't have the right to comment on the events was Mr. Holly. And that made him stand out from the rest of the actors. And also I thought that's how you make the main character main, because he wasn't there like too much, and he didn't have a lot of lines, but what made him the main character was the inability to comment on the events, you know, and immediately he sort of stood out from the rest, you know. So now I'm coming back to this documentary theater approach, because at the moment I'm writing a play about the scandal of David Beckham and Rebecca Loss from 2005, and it's going to be called Beckham, and I'm going to use this style again. You know, it's going to be not so much documentary, but we will have comments of some of the characters on what's going on stage, and because it's such a good device, you know, I can't get rid of it, you know. So we'll see how it's going to work with this. In this case, it will definitely give us opportunity to put a bigger perspective to the play, you know. I think this approach might work or can work when you have a topic that's like too big for the play. You cannot squeeze it all in, you cannot get all the information in, or sometimes there's a whole background to the story that you cannot reveal in action. So you have to have a narration, you know. And this Beckham story, it's not a story of Beckham actually, it's a story of a guy who was a master of the puppets in the background, and he mastered the famous scandal for British tabloid press. He was called Max Clifford, and he was a sleazy guy, really sleazy guy that would blackmail politicians. You know, he would organize a party, invite horse. He would take some secret pictures of politicians. He would blackmail the politicians. Then, you know, such a guy. But sometimes he would use his influence to help other people. You know, and eventually you realize he's a donor of some hospitals, and he has a good side to it. And he keeps it good side completely secret, because he says, I want to be a bastard. I'm the bad guy, please don't tell them I paid for these patients in these crippled little children in this hospital. That might ruin my reputation of a old fucker, you know. So this sort of a guy, you know. And of course he realized, he takes this big case and he says, this is going to be the biggest case for British tabloid press, you know. And he has it combined with British television and all that, you know, how the girl should appear, you know. And they fabricate the whole story, how she slept with Beckham, although it's obvious she sort of didn't, you know. They just kissed on the corner somewhere where she worked for the production company that worked for him. So they fabricate the whole story about this, because he sent her some SMS messages. So they fabricate it, and it's a big story and big success and big scandal. But only later on he realizes that was actually David Beckham's wife who organized it all to change his the way he's portrayed in the media, because they realized good guys are no longer in demand, and the audience likes bad guys, you know. So this is the way how to make David Beckham a bad guy also, because he's attached to so many other companies, you know, and they demand not such a clear face, you know. They want somebody who's a bit dirty, you know. So this Max Clifford realized that he was misused by a campaign by the Beckhams actually, and it makes him angry, and he starts to fight back against the Beckham, and he ends up in jail actually. So this is the story, but the background of the story is very big, you know. It's the short period of time between the SMS messages started and before the social media started. Because when the social media started in 2009 roughly, then people started to do their own dirt, you know, themselves. You know, they started to promote themselves via social media, you know. So you didn't have to go to the tabloid press to say something bad about yourself, you know, or about somebody else, you know. You simply put it on your wall on your Facebook. You know, so that was the short period of time when British tabloid press or tabloid press in the world blossomed, because they used evidence of text messages and made big scandals out of that, you know. So there's also this sort of nostalgia, you know, before the social media came and destroyed the good quality shit press, you know. That's it. We'll see how it goes, you know. It's going to premiere in November in Prague.